The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $230 on a hot, clear July morning in 2006 at the Beaver County Livestock Auction Barn Equipment Sale outside Beaver, Oklahoma. And the man in the bright red yoked western shirt standing under the open auction, she had let out a high-yipping cattle auctioneer's laugh that turned the heads of every panhandle wheat farmer and stock truck driver standing along the pipe rail. Hank Lockridge, full-time cattle auctioneer at the Beaver Livestock Auction Barn for 23 years, was 54, 6 feet, and lean as a fence post. Sandy gray hair clipped close under a tall white Stetson open-road hat. A clean-shaven jaw. Sharp pale blue eyes behind gold-rimmed Texan aviators pushed back on his head. A deep, panhandle sun-weathered face. He wore a bright red yoked western shirt with white piping along the yoke and mother-of-pearl snaps over a white undershirt. Dark navy western slacks with a sharp ironed crease. Polished black ostrich-skin cowboy boots stitched in white with brass toe tips. A wide tooled leather belt with a heavy silver Cattlemen's Association buckle the size of a dinner plate, and a thin Bluetooth speaker headset clipped to one ear. He had run the small machinery side of the Beaver Livestock Equipment Sale Annex for 15 years, and the surplus sale had been called for the back lot of the auction barn. The 1949 Sterling H.C. wrecker at the back of the sale list had been on the barn's books since 1990, and Hank had told the auctioneer privately the consignment had carried it for $50 cash. The 24-year-old shop mechanic in the faded brown duck canvas work coat at the back of the bidders had just outbid the consignment for $230 against Hank's casual $70 yipped opening shot, and Hank was making sure the panhandle wheat farmers understood the joke. Dalton McCoon folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his work coat and walked through the cattle pen dust to the truck. The Sterling H.C. was 23 feet of long-nose conventional cab, heavy iron, with the distinctive Sterling chain drive housing at the rear axle. The cab faded, cattleman's cream, oxidized to chalky bone white along the body panels and rust brown along the lower door edges from 40 Oklahoma summers. The chrome Sterling script badge tarnished, both round chrome side cab mirrors snapped, the home's 525 wrecker boom with a hand-cranked single-drum winch listing 2 degrees right with a frayed cable, the wooden cargo deck split and warped from the heat, 3 of the 6 tires flat, the word junk spray-painted in flaking branding iron red block letters across the driver's door. A dual saddle tank arrangement ran along both frame rails behind the cab. The right side tank still connected to the fuel line. The left side secondary tank long since disconnected and capped at both fittings. Dalton had grown up 4 miles north of the truck's last parking spot, on a small wheat and cattle place outside Beaver. His grandfather, Garland McCoon, was waiting at the trailer. Garland was 78, a retired Oklahoma Panhandle wheat farmer and farm implement mechanic for 41 years, 5'10", lean and erect, with broad, bony shoulders and a slight stoop, snow-white hair under a battered straw western hat with a sweat-stained band, a thick white mustache, deep watery hazel eyes in a panhandle weathered face, large knotted hands. A stubby corncob pipe sat unlit between his teeth. He wore a faded tan canvas chore coat unbuttoned over a faded blue chambray workshirt buttoned to the throat, faded dark blue dungarees held up with brown leather suspenders, scuffed brown leather lace-up roper boots, and a plain dark brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle stamped with a small windmill silhouette. Garland set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted bumper of the Sterling and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Bo Wakefield's old H.C. Beauregard. Wakefield had run Wakefield Panhandle Recovery out of a concrete block shop on US 64 outside Hooker, Oklahoma, from 1972 until the heat stroke, working the red clay grade above the Cimarron and the spring stock truck haul roads above Boise City, pulling stuck Hereford cattle haulers off back grades, and overturned wheat trucks out of the spring switchbacks above the Beaver River. He had built the Holmes 525 wrecker boom himself onto the Sterling's rear deck in 1974, with the help of two welders from the Beaver Livestock Auction Barn Shop on a long Memorial Day weekend. He had married a Guyman girl named Lurleen Riggs in 1965, and they had a daughter, Sage, born in 1967. Bo had died in July of 1990. He had been rigging a stuck cattle truck recovery on US 64 outside Hooker at 1 in the afternoon on a 112-degree panhandle afternoon when he had collapsed from heat stroke beside his own truck and could not be revived. He was 58 years old. Sage was 23 and away at Agriculture College at Oklahoma State. The Sterling had been recovered by another wrecker out of Liberal and parked behind the Wakefield shop on US 64. Lurleen had paid the property tax on the shop for 15 years until she remarried in 2005 and moved to Stillwater. The lot was let go to the county that fall, and the inventory consigned to the Beaver Livestock Auction Barn Annex. The Sterling sat in the back of the auction barn lot for a year until the surplus sale. Dalton had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a Hooker stock truck driver that Bo Wakefield's truck was finally being sold. They winched the HC onto Dalton's borrowed gooseneck trailer. Hank Lockridge stood under the open auction shed in his bright red yoked western shirt and watched, the Bluetooth headset still clipped to his ear, and as Dalton pulled out, he called across the cattle pen dust that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, the auction barn would arrange disposal for $50 cash. Dalton did not answer. Garland climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 17 miles north, up US 270, to Garland's pole barn shop behind a small white clapboard farmhouse on the edge of a wheat section outside Beaver, the dead Sterling rocking behind them on the dry panhandle pavement, the Holmes 525 boom pointing at the hot blue Oklahoma sky like a bent finger. The restoration would take 18 years. Nobody knew that on the drive north. Dalton worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Guymon during the week and drove 40 minutes east on US 270 to Garland's pole barn every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the dual saddle tanks because Garland insisted. They drained the right side primary tank and steam cleaned it. They drained the left side secondary tank and found that nothing came out, and the dipstick measured no fuel, and the cap had been welded shut with a small hand-applied tack weld around the rim. Garland made a note, and they set the secondary tank aside on the bench. They pulled the Sterling 451 cubic inch inline-six gasoline engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true. The head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long panhandle summer went into the engine and into stories about Bo Wakefield. Garland told Dalton about the night in 1979 when Bo pulled a stuck Hereford cattle hauler out of a Cimarron Creek crossing at -4 degrees and refused payment, except for a side of grass-finished beef. He told Dalton about the morning in 1982, when Bo hauled a snapped case tractor out of a wheat field above Boise City and let the farmer pay him in 50 bushels of hard red winter wheat for his own bread flour. He told stories about Lurleen Wakefield's chicken and dumplings. The second year, they sand-blasted the heat-weathered frame down to clean steel. By the 5th year, the cab came off. In the 7th year, Garland slowed. He had a small heart attack in May and was at the Beaver County Memorial Hospital for 9 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hands still worked. He told Dalton the truck would wait. By the 9th year, the Sterling was a roller. In the 11th year, Dalton's daughter was born, and the work paused for a month. By the 14th year, Garland sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding wooden chair beside the pole barn wood stove, the battered straw western hat pulled low against the panhandle dust, the stubby corncob pipe between his teeth, pointing at what to do next. Through all those years, Hank Lockridge drove past the foot of Garland's gravel drive on US 270 sometimes in his polished black Cadillac CTS, with the Cattlemen's Association silver decal on the side door on his way to a Wichita area cattle sale, the tall white Stetson visible through the windshield. The Cadillac always slowed at the bottom of the drive, but never quite turned in. By the 15th year, the Sterling was painted. They had wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy cattleman's cream that matched a faded snapshot Garland had of the truck from 1976. And they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking branding iron red junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Dalton did not know why. He just left it. By the 17th year, the Holmes 525 boom was rebuilt with a fresh aircraft-grade single-drum cable. By the 18th year, the Sterling was nearly whole. They had not yet cut open the disconnected left side secondary saddle tank to inspect for internal corrosion before sealing it for storage. The secondary tank was the last thing on the list, because Garland always said you start with what makes the truck move and you finish with what holds her fuel in case the highway is long. On a hot, clear morning of July the 6th of the 18th year, Dalton pulled into Garland's pole barn with a thin cut-off wheel and an angle grinder. He was 42 years old. The brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across his right elbow from a hot exhaust manifold in 2015 was a faint line, and his hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Garland was 96. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the pole barn wood stove with a heavy plaid cotton blanket over his knees, the battered straw western hat pulled low, the stubby corncob pipe between his teeth. Dalton set the disconnected left side secondary saddle tank up on 2 sawhorses at the workbench with the welded cap facing the floor. He started to cut a slow, careful inspection seam around the upper rim of the tank shell, and he stopped. There was a small steel pouch, arc-welded to the inside of the tank shell, visible through the parted seam on the upper rim. The pouch was sized to fit in the empty fuel cavity, and the weld bead was hand-applied. Dalton set down the grinder. He cut a slow, careful seam along the 4 sides of the pouch and lifted the pouch free of the tank shell. He carried the pouch to the workbench under the clip-on lamp. He cut the soldered seam along the bottom edge with a heated putty knife and tipped the contents into his open palm. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas bound with brown twine, were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 110 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper totaling $2,200. There was a small brass charter member's badge with a small enameled longhorn and windmill emblem in the center, and the engraved words Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association / charter member / 1935 around the brass face above 3 small initials. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 8 in a knit toque and a tan canvas barn coat sitting on a Beaver auction barn pipe rail with a black baldy Hereford calf nuzzling her elbow. The date, October 1975, written on the back in pencil. And there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded, but legible. Dalton unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated July the 12th of 1990. It read, "To my sage, the cash is for whatever a young woman needs at 18 when the Panhandle cannot hold her. The badge is your grandfather Cyril's. He was a 1935 charter member of the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association out of Beaver County, and he wore that badge on his lapel at the Beaver auction barn every Tuesday from 1935 until he retired in 1968 and gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1950. The photograph is of you the morning your grandfather walked you down to the auction barn for the first time. I am welding these inside the disconnected secondary saddle tank because the July sun on US 64 above Hooker has been 110 for 10 days running, and I do not want them lost if I cannot make it back from the next stuck cattle truck call. The truck is yours when you're old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Beauregard Cyril Wakefield, Hooker, Oklahoma, July 12, 1990. Dalton sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Garland held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. He said quietly, "Beau wrote this 6 days before the heat took him on the US 64 shoulder. The girl never knew." They drove south to Beaver the next Saturday. Garland had called a Hooker stock truck driver whose niece kept the Beaver County Wheat and Cattle Co-op office, and the niece had given them a current address for Sage Wakefield Riggs on a small wheat and cattle place outside Beaver. They drove down US 270 under a clear hot Panhandle morning, past long sections of summer wheat, and parked in front of a small white clapboard ranch office with a hand-painted wooden sign above the door reading Wakefield Riggs Wheat and Cattle. The woman who came out of the office in a faded tan canvas barn coat was 57 years old. She had Beauregard Wakefield's broad shoulders and her father's deep hazel eyes. She wore a faded tan canvas Carhartt-style barn coat, open over a faded indigo cotton workshirt, faded dark blue dungarees, scuffed brown leather roper boots covered in Panhandle red clay dust, a small silver longhorn pendant on a thin silver chain at her throat, and a thin gold wedding band on her left ring finger. Garland spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his sterling in my pole barn in 1982. My grandson here bought the H.C. at the Beaver Livestock Surplus Sale 18 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something welded inside her secondary saddle tank that belongs to you." Sage's face changed. She brought them into a small ranch office kitchen, and they sat at a round oak table, and Dalton set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the brass badge, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Sage picked up the brass charter member's badge. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving around the face. She said her grandfather Cyril had been a 1935 charter member of the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association out of Beaver County, that the family had been told the badge had been buried with him in 1969, and that she had been looking through Beaver County estate sales for 30 years for that badge. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her north to Garland's pole barn the next morning. Sage walked slowly around the Sterling 3 times in the open bay. She ran her hand along the chrome Sterling script badge across the long hood and the distinctive chain drive housing at the rear axle. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking branding iron red junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Dalton and she asked the price. Dalton looked at his grandfather. Garland laid both hands on his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone, and then we are going to drive her down US 64 to Hooker and park her at the empty concrete block lot where Wakefield Panhandle Recovery stood until July of 1990, and we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1972. The boy paid $230 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you. They finished the Sterling through that autumn. Sage drove down from her wheat place every other Sunday. On the morning of October the 18th of the 19th year, they rolled the HC out of Garland's pole barn under a clear blue Oklahoma sky and drove her in convoy west on US 64 to Hooker and parked her facing the empty concrete block lot where Wakefield Panhandle Recovery had stood. Dalton handed Sage a small can of deep cream paint and a 1-inch brush. Sage climbed up on the running board and painted out the flaking branding iron red junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, Wakefield Panhandle Recovery. Established 1972. Old enough to drive her without breaking her? She stepped down. A polished black Cadillac CTS went by on US 64. Hank Lockridge was driving with the tall white Stetson on the passenger seat. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Sterling at the empty concrete block lot with the cream door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not yip. He drove on. The Sterling sits on US 64 outside Hooker today, and the sign on the door reads, Wakefield Panhandle Recovery, established 1972. Sage runs the wheat and cattle place outside Beaver. The $2,200 sits in a small lockbox at her ranch office. The 1935 Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association charter member's badge sits beside it. The 1975 photograph is framed above her kitchen table. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her closet. She reads it once a year on the 12th of July. If you ever see an old Sterling HC parked along US 64 outside Hooker, with the words Wakefield Panhandle Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down, roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a cattle auctioneer in a tall white Stetson would have arranged disposal for $50 cash, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.